Welcome to Using Vue with ASP.NET Core by Example. My name is Sean Wildermuth of Wilderminds. In this module, we'll be talking about working with APIs. We're going to start by talking about how to access APIs. I'll show you how to manipulate data once you have it. I'll introduce you to form binding, input validation, and sending data back to the server. We'll also tackle server-side validation to go with our input validation. Let's get started. So let's start by accessing APIs directly inside Vue. Back in Visual Studio, let's go ahead and open our index page. And the first thing I'm going to want to do is just get rid of all these products. I want to replace these with a call to an API. And if you remember, we talked about the lifecycle. We have this mounted function, which we'll go ahead and use to actually call the API. So if we go over to Vue.js.org, inside the ecosystem will be this Vue curated, which is going to have a list of different libraries that we can use. There are some core libraries that Vue itself has built, including the Vue router and Vuex, which we'll look at later in the course. But here at the bottom, I'm going to pick Vue curated. And this will allow us to look at what kind of libraries they think are sort of the main ones that many people are going to use. And one of them is this data library called Axios. This is a promise-based HTTP client. Now, if you decided that you have another framework that you think would work just as well, and you already have comfort with it, go ahead and use that. But we're going to use Axios to do the work of actually calling the server to make that network request. So if we come back here to Visual Studio, let's go ahead and open package.json, and we're just going to go into our list of client-side dependencies that we're using in the package.json, and we're just going to go ahead and add Axios. We'll see it shows up, and then it's going to give us some of the versions that are out there. I'll just pick the latest version, and in the background, it'll install the packages. We'll actually see down here, installing packages complete. So let's open the Vue. We'll just need to include it here before our filters. And then back in the JavaScript, we're just going to want to call it here on the mounted function. Axios exposes methods for each of the verbs. So there's a get, a post, etc. We're going to use get and just call our API, which is that API products, in order to get that list of products. This returns a promise, so we can then just say then, and then give a callback function. And then also do a catch in case there's an error, and again, another callback function. Inside the catch, we can just say this.error equals could not load products. And in the callback for the success, we'll just need to be passed in the result, and we should be able to just then say this.products equals res.data. Data is going to be the payload of the API call. So with all that set, let's just go ahead and run that. And at this point, it's not showing anything. And the reason for that is kind of interesting. If we come back to the store, we'll actually see that we were setting the products and the data here. In fact, if we open up the debugger and go to our index page, let's go ahead and set a breakpoint here at our products. Go ahead and make this a little bigger so it's a little easier to see. And let's put it in the error as well, just in case we're actually returning an error. And let's refresh the page. And here we're actually successfully getting that data. There's our data, there's our information. But the problem is that there's no products on this. But I defined this as this products. Why doesn't it work? The reason is fairly simple. When we're inside of this function, Vue is automatically setting the this function to the data object. That's how we can go ahead and use this.products inside of this. So if we had said something like this.error equals empty string, just to clear out that error, that would actually work great. It would know what error is. But because these are embedded functions here, we're losing the function scope. This is creating a new this pointer inside of this callback function. And so what we need to do is actually say bind this. This bind is telling it, oh, when you create this function, bind the this pointer to our outer this pointer. This is a complexity of JavaScript, not really Vue. And this is one of the places where, because Vue doesn't do some things, like in this case, the network requests, you're going to have to understand the ecosystem a little better. If Vue had decided to have their own, they probably would have solved this particular problem for you. So we're sort of getting the benefit of using a full ecosystem out on the web, but we're losing some of that integration that we might have if we had the one giant framework to rule them all. The other problem we have is if we call localhost API products, the object we're actually getting isn't the raw just collection here. It's some information about the paging itself. The data that we're dealing with actually needs to be not just data, but data.results. And this is a side effect in that our API return value is this data element, but it contains other information than just the raw results. So because we're including page information and maybe even some other information depending on the call, we're going to want to step down and actually use the results, which is the raw set of JSON data that was returned. Once we do both of these things, get rid of our breakpoints, and get rid of the debugger and refresh, it should be showing us our product list. But in fact, we actually have an error in the console. We're seeing that val is undefined in our filters. Why does filters have to do with this? If we go and look at our filters, we'll notice that it assumes that the data that's being sent down here has actually been defined. So we probably should protect these filters in some way, but let's ignore it at the moment because probably what is happening is that the data we're getting back is shaped differently than the products we had originally defined. Let's look at what's actually being returned in products. So if we look at the data coming back, we'll notice that the list price is here and that we actually called it price. So let's see if this is actually the culprit, this list price. Come back to the store and refresh. We can see our products now showing up. Images are a little stretched and we can fix that in a minute, but we can see that the other parts of our product are actually showing up. There's our libbies, price, etc. We're getting all the data we actually want. Notice it's still showing a British pound, so we just change our money filter here to say we want 2 digits. We should be all good. Another of the properties that we don't have here is the on sale, but because we're not using it in a filter, it's doing what it's supposed to do. This ends up being false so that text success doesn't get set. Same with the background secondary, because an undefined property is the same as saying false. So it's all working fine. The reality is, because we don't have it on our server side, let's go ahead and clean that up and just get rid of the on saleness here, because that'll never be true, so why bother including it? So let's go ahead and fix those images by just adding the class we need. And in this case, I'm going to say float right and image thumbnail. Again, both parts of Bootstrap. And to make this really work the way we want, I'm going to just move the image into the card body. If we refresh this now, we'll see that our images show up just to the right of all our data, and they're a little bit more uniform, and because they're sort of low res, they're going to look better on the page, as well as that thumbnail has given us that gray outline so that they're easier to see. So here we're going to want to create another div, and this is going to be another alert that we want to show, and I'm going to say alert info. And I just want it to say loading so that we can show something on the page that's going to represent telling the user that we're doing some work. Because that network request might be quick or might be slow, we'd like to be able to show a loading while it's doing that work. So let's go ahead and include a font awesome spinner as well, just so the user has something interesting to look at. If you haven't used font awesome before, this may be a little confusing, but we're just telling it that we want a solid font awesome icon. We want to use the spinner, and then we actually want to use an animation to make it spin around. If we look at that, we can now see the spinning icon and it say loading, but we'd like to make it appear and disappear as necessary. We're going to do that by adding a v if and just call it is busy. So this will be shown if our view is busy doing something like a network request. So if we come back here and say is busy equals false, so its default behavior is that it's not going to be busy. But down here, before we make the network request, we can say is busy equals true, and then go ahead and set it back to false in both of our callbacks. So this is essentially going to say, make it appear between when I set it here and when the network request comes back to set it here. Let's see if it works. You might be able to see it flash if we're really careful, but let's open up that debugger. Let's come down here and let's just stop it here for a moment. And we'll actually see the loading appear, and if we continue it on, we'll see it disappear once it's been used. Now, of course, I'm on a local machine here. It should be incredibly fast, but it will be an indication for our users when we actually deploy this out into a real-world scenario. So next, let's talk about something that Vue calls transitions. Let's start by manipulating some of the data that we got from the server. We're going to open up our Vue. Before we build this row of products, let's go ahead and create some space and just create a new div. In this div, I will say button group. It's going to create a set of buttons that are all connected to each other, forming sort of a logical grouping. And then we can just create ordinary buttons. I'll say button info. Then inside the button, I'll say sort by price. I'll create another one to sort by name. While we're here, let's go ahead and create a link over to our checkout page. And we'll just make it look like a button as well. If we look at the change now, we'll see these 3 buttons here at the top of our page, and checkout will show us a link at the bottom, but the sort by price and name are ones we're going to want to use data binding to manipulate the data inside of our view. And the way we're going to do that is just add a v_on_click, and we'll create a new method called onSort, and I'm going to tell it what I want to sort it by, so I don't have to create a new method for each one, in case later I end up having a lot of these, and then here I'll say by name. In this case, I want it to be the same property name, so it's actually going to be list price, even though I'm just saying price here. Let's go implement that. Let's open up our indexpage.js, and then our methods, I'll just create the onSort function. And here we'll just accept the name that we're going to sort by just as a variable to the method. And here I'd like to have a simple and easy way to sort it, so I'm actually going to use a third-party library that Vue works really well with. So let's come down here to our package.json, our npm, and I'm going to add another library we're going to use called Lodash. Lodash is a smaller, in many ways quicker version of underscore, which you may have some familiarity with. If you don't know how any of these work, this is actually similar to the C# concept of link directly in JavaScript. It's a bunch of helper functions to allow us to manipulate data in different ways. Back on our view, let's go ahead and add this new library, and it's just going to be lib lodash lodash.js. There's no dist folder in that one, and I'll just put the min version of that as well. And once we've included Lodash back here in our index page, we can actually use it. What we can say is this.products equals sort by, and notice that I'm using an underscore character as the object name. That is what Lodash uses for the object name that has all the helper functions on it. So it looks really weird, but it's just a convention that underscore started and then Lodash implemented and used it as well. So we're going to sort the products by whatever we're passing in here, which is the name of a property. So by doing this, we should go ahead and replace the products with these new products that have been sorted. Let's see how it works. So I've refreshed it to get the new code, and if I say sort by price, we'll see that starting with the lowest price going all the way to the highest priced item. If I go back to sort by name, it'll start with the things that start with C's and go all the way down to things that start with Y. We can go back and forth, and we're not going back to the server each time. We certainly could do that, and there might be some benefit to that, especially if we're using paging or things like that. There are many occasions where you want to be able to manipulate this sort of data directly in memory and just let the data binding react to it. So next, let's implement this checkout page. So now let's look at form binding. We're going to start back in the index.cs.html file, and if you remember, we created this link over to the checkout page. But the link here is wrong. We're actually going to want it to be /_/. If we want to be smart about it, we could actually use ASP.NET to do this and just say that this is ASP controller is going to be root, and ASP action is going to be checkout. And I know that because here in the controller is that checkout action on the root controller. The benefit of using the ASP.NET controller and action here instead of the raw link is it's going to make this whatever the URL is for that. If we decide to reorganize how our URLs are going to work later, we don't have to go find every instance in a markup page to make that happen. So now let's click that checkout. We can now see the form that we're going to use to include information from the user about where we should ship it and what their name is and phone number and all those happy things. What we'd like to do is be able to bind these directly to data inside of a view. So let's create a new view for this page. First thing we'll need to do in the checkout.cs.html is create a section for our scripts, just like we did in the index. And let's go ahead and copy all of the scripts except for the index page right in there, because we're going to probably need all of these. And let's go ahead and create a new JavaScript file called checkout.js. And back in checkout.cs.html, let's go ahead and just drag it in there so we have our main script last for our page. So in this file, just like we've done before, we'll go ahead and create a new view that's going to take an object that's going to tell us how to actually manipulate it. So we're going to start with that EL or element, and let's see what this actually looks like. We have an ID here called checkout, and so let's actually use that and say we're going to be responsible for everything inside that checkout. Let's also create a new data section, just like we did before. And we'll create an object called customer that we could just start with an empty set of brackets. But instead of doing that, let's go ahead and create our customer with the default properties of what we would want them to be. And so this is obviously going to be name, phone, address, and this address is going to be a complex object in itself. And that'll have address line 1. And if I had reasons to have different defaults, I could certainly put it in here. So city, town, state, province, postal code, and country. Now I'm getting this structure here actually by looking at what I have in the server side. Let me go ahead and close that node modules and look at data. And inside the entities, we have a customer object that has a name, company, phone, username, and then a set of addresses. And so this collection of addresses, we're actually just going to be able to create one. And in that case, it's going to have all those properties we just talked about. Don't worry about setting the IDs because we're going to let the server set those for us. Now that we have these, we can go ahead and set up our binding. Over in our checkout page, you remember we have the labels for each one of those properties we just talked about. And the way you set this up as far as binding goes is you actually use a directive called vModel, and you set it to the data property that you want to bind. And so in this case, that's going to be customer.name. And vModel is different from vBind in that vBind is a one-way relationship from the Vue object to the actual binding here. ViewModel is a two-way binding. So when this input is changed, it's going to push the changes down into this customer.name, but also pull it from customer.name when it changes through code. So the vModel is essentially a two-way binding. So I'm going to copy this to the rest of these with their same names. But when I get down to the addresses, this is going to be down one line. So it's now going to be customer.address.address line 1. And then for the successive ones, it's going to be just changing this last little bit. So now that we have them all set up, we can go here to the form and simply say v_on_submit. That is a method that is a handler for when the form is submitted. We don't have to actually handle it on the button click. And I'll just say on save that I want to go ahead and submit this. Let's go back over to checkout and let's create our methods object. And I'll go ahead and just create the on save. And here I'm just going to use an alert again to just pop up some message. And that message is going to be json.stringify. So I'm going to take the object and create a JSON string so we can really see the data that's being shown. And then I'm just going to say this.customer. Because remember that this pointer is pointing at the data object. So we should be able to get this whole object as just JSON. If we refresh our page, we put some data in here. And I press next. The alert is showing. You can see the entire thing happening. And then when I press OK, it's causing the post to actually posting back to the server. Of course, the server isn't listening for that. So we're ending up back on this page. It's clearing out all the data we had and causing all the scripts to be reloaded, which is not what we want. So one of the tricks here with the v_on is we can actually say .prevent. This is the same as in our onSave saying return false or preventing the bubbling of that call DOM in the browser, allowing us to really be the only ones that are going to take care of that. So if we do it now that we've done the prevent, we press next, we'll see that data. There's the Sean and then the embedded objects, but then it'll leave us on this page. It prevented that from cascading down or for our needs to really cause the post because we're going to handle all the work for actually doing the post. We're not going to be doing it through actually form posting. We're going to be doing it through JavaScript. So one of the problems we have here is that we can put in all sorts of willy-nilly data here and try to send them to the server eventually. We'd like to actually be able to do some validation here. Vue has some interesting libraries for doing that. Let's see what that looks like next. So now let's talk about validation. If we come back over to the code, what we'd like to do is be able to tell the different pieces of code that we want them to know about whether they're required or they have a certain format. And you can certainly do that on the server. And there's great examples out there of using ASP.NET Core to do this if you're just using jQuery and jQuery validation. But we're going to do it directly with Vue. Vue itself does not have a validation subsystem in it. It relies on the community. So we go back to Vue.js.org. In the ecosystem at the bottom, there's going to be two options. Vue Curated, which is a small set of libraries to do very discrete things that they believe in. And they also have Awesome Vue, which is a huge list of all sorts of libraries. And validation is in this Awesome Vue list. So we look at that, it's actually just a GitHub repository, but it essentially just creates a list of kinds of resources. So when we start to look at components and libraries, it's broken them up into different sections: UI components, UI layout, frameworks, utilities, etc. I'm going to actually just search for the word validation, and you'll see form validation being here under UI utilities. So let's click on that. We can see there's a handful of different validation libraries, and often they do them in very different ways. Some of them want to work well with other libraries like the jQuery validation stuff. Some of them want to have their own that is primarily code-based. Or the one that I'm going to show you, VEE Validate, is a way to specify validation directly in the Vue where it often is going to be useful. Now, I don't care which validation you use here. The important part of the story is you're going to need client-side validation before you send them back to the server. We will talk about server-side validation in a little bit, but let's start with the client-side validation with vValidate. So let's go back to our package.json file, and let's add that as another dependency, VEE Validate. And we'll need to add that to our checkout page. As we start to see these lists of libraries getting bigger and bigger, you might be asking yourself, when should I start to think about packaging these together to limit the number of file requests and things like that? I think that's a really laudable goal, but I usually worry about that once we complete a project or once we're starting to talk about using the project in production. At that point, you'll be able to use things like Browserify or Webpack or even using gulp scripts to put together these different libraries together, whichever way you want to actually do it. We're going to look at in future modules how to actually do that. So don't worry too much about it at this point in the game. We will get there. And if we show all files again, we can just see where VEE Validate is in the node modules. And it's just VEE-validate in both cases. So I'll just put our magic dash in there. It's going to be in a dist folder like most libraries now. And then I'll just say VEE Validate. And I'm actually going to choose the non-min version because we might want some of the debug information in there. Later on, we'll certainly want to be able to switch it back out to the min version. Now that we've included this, we have to do two things to make this work. First, in checkout, we need to opt into it. Because including the library itself may not be enough, we actually need to say view.use and then VE validate is the object we want to use. This essentially is something called a plugin, and it adds all the VEE validate stuff into Vue so that it'll know about it during the cycle of our Vue object. Notice this is happening at the global level, and that's essentially how you handle plugins, is you add them at the global level for your application. Because we're using this in two different places, we may never need it in the index page, so we might never call the use VE validate so that we're dealing with less code in the browser when we're actually dealing with it. So now that we've opted into it, what can we do with it? Let's go over to checkout, and on the end of each input, we're going to want to do a couple of things. First, we're going to want to specify a name here so we know the name of this label. The reason this is important is that when validation errors happen, we want to be able to find them by name. And instead of them knowing it by the binding, it's actually going to look for it as the name of the actual control here. And so I'm going to call this name, which may be a little confusing. We could certainly do customer name just to make it a little less confusing. And then we're just going to say vValidate, probably are guessing now where it got its name, and include here what kind of validations we want to use. We go over to the VE Validate project, let's go over to the documentation and demos, and this is going to show you all the available rules. You can certainly write your own, but this adds a number of rules. Validate a credit card, date format, min, regex, max value, etc. And so these are some strong rules for you to be able to use. The first one we're going to use is actually required. And what we're going to do here, there's two formats for this. Either you can put embedded quotes in here and just say required. And in this case, you can separate each of the validations with a pipe, or the one that I think is a little bit more verbose, but I think it's a little clear, and that is using a tiny piece of JSON. So in this case, it's going to say required true. And if I had another one, I would just list another property name. For now, required true should be simple enough. We're just saying what is the name of the validation to use and what to do. When we actually want to read it, though, We'd like to be able to take the input here and we'd like to be able to change its class. So you may have remembered earlier we had this way of binding to the class element, and by doing this we're going to add to the existing class here. We're not replacing the class here, we're just adding optionally something to the class. And here I can ask for us to tell it what class name to add if this second part is true. So we're going to tell it that we want to add border danger. That's going to make the border of the input itself change colors if the errors has one for customer name. This will return a true or false based on whether the error collection has customer name as a problem, and add border danger if it needs to. So we go back over, and as soon as we leave the name, it should turn red because it's required. We would like to actually show this in a better way, but this is a good start. We can see that that's an error, but we're not really telling the user what the error is. We come back, we can see the entire error collection here. Let's put it in here temporarily by just binding to the errors. And by binding to the errors, we can see there's no items at first, but then when we tab through it, we're getting items as a collection, and there's a field called customer name. And if we had more rules, it would show all the rules there. Formatting this in a way to make it useful for the user might not be as interesting. Let's do it a different way. Now that we can see the errors there, let's show the error name to the user. We'll do that by adding a span here. I'm just going to put the color of danger here, text danger. This is from Bootstrap 4, of course. And then I'm just going to bind to errors, which is a collection put on the view by the validation. And I'm going to look for the first called customer name. Just like we're setting the class name here, I'm going to actually show the error itself by calling customer. And I'll go ahead and use VIF again to just only show this span when that happens. So we're not taking up any space that we don't need to. So I'll say if errors.has customer name. So if we go back to the page and refresh, when we leave this, we can still see that the error is there like we could before, but now we're actually showing the error when it happens. And this way we're giving the user a clue about what needs to be fixed. When we fix it, of course, the color goes away and the text goes away. Awesome. But what if we have more than one kind of validation? On the vValidate website, which is at v-validate-logarithm, that's logaretm.com, you'll see at the bottom a list of available rules. You'll see some like min for min size, max for max size, max value and min value, numeric, regex, which is important. There's that required we've been using. Let's go ahead and use the min for our name. So we come back here and just add to the validation by saying min, which is the validation type. And in this case, instead of just saying true, we're going to actually give it a value, minimum of 5 characters or 15 characters or whatever you want. By making that small change, when we refresh and we skip it, we're still getting required. But if we start to type in it, the error now changes to the length it needs to be. And of course, once we reach 5, it'll go away as expected. So this is going to give us the opportunity to do things like validate the phone number, validate the address line, and all of these. And we can choose the different kinds of validation based on the data we're trying to validate against. For example, phone number, we might want the actual phone number for the user, and we want to validate that it's a valid phone number, which can be a complex sort of thing. Let's come back to our page and let's get rid of errors. So I'm going to want to do the validation for the rest of the form, and I'm not going to make you sit here and watch me do them all, but let's talk about a few of them. First, on each of the inputs here, I'm going to make sure that I give it a name, and I'll call it phone, which is the same extension I'm using here on phone. And then vValidate, I'm going to use the shortened version, which is embedded quotes inside the outer quotes, and just put required for now. We might come back and do some phone number validation here, but for now I'm just going to say required. And I'm going to copy this so I can do the same to address 1. So here, I'm going to want to put the name of address 1 and still say it's required. Now, notice I'm using the address 1 here, even though the actual name of the property is address line 1. They do not need to match. When we created these V models in the last video, we were able to navigate down here, but we're really just using the validation aside from the model. The model is there to do the two-way binding, and the validation is there to say whether it's valid or not. On address line 2 and 3, I'm not even going to include them because we don't need address line 2 or 3 to be required or in some special format, so we can leave them alone. And then finally, for city and state and zip, or postal code if you prefer, those are going to need to be required as well. So let's put city, town here, and I'll leave that as required. State, province, and I'm just using the same names as the properties for now, and postal code. They're all going to be required at this point. Remember that because we're using them, we also want to add that special class binding. This class binding is going to match the has with whatever the name of the control is. So I'll go ahead and add these classes and these spans to each one of the controls, and I'm going to do it while paused so you don't have to watch me just type for 5 minutes. I'll be right back. Now that I've added these to each of those controls, when we refresh, we can now see that we're getting the errors as we need them on each class. I won't go through all the individual type of validation, but this is a good way to do the validation. But there's a couple more problems here with the validation. One is that we can press next at any point without having all of these done, and that's probably not what we want. So if we come down here to the button, in order to make this button not work, we're going to want to actually bind to disabled, which is a special kind of binding because it's actually going to mark the button as disabled when something happens. In this case, I'm going to say errors any. So if there are any errors whatsoever, then make sure this button is disabled. Let's see how that works. So right now it's enabled, and we can probably fix that in a moment. But as we start to show errors, we'll see that the next button is now disabled. But as we fix them, next becomes enabled again. And so that allows us to have a pretty simple way to enable and disable a form. But we have one more little trick here. And that is if we don't want to have it disabled, but actually show the errors. So let's get rid of this idea of disabling it because it can be a little wonky. Let's go to checkout, and on save, instead of popping up this right now, we're going to want to call the API at some point. But before we can do it, we're going to want to make sure that it's valid data. This is a replacement for actually disabling the button. This is going to guarantee that all the validators have been called, that you're not going to catch yourself in some strange race condition. So we're going to look at this pointer, and it's going to have a new property called validator. This is something that's put on the this pointer by the validation system, by vValidate. The $sign here is to indicate that it is a built-in object, and you'll see this used throughout the Vue system, not just vValidate. And I'm going to call validate all. So validate all is actually in an asynchronous method, and it's asynchronous because there's some validations that may be asynchronous as well. You could imagine writing a validation rule that supports calling an API or something else to make sure that something's valid. And because it returns a promise, we then have to call then and pass it a callback. This callback is going to hand us a result. And from that result, we can just check did it succeed or not. So if the result is true, we can go ahead and call the API. And this has a side effect, this pattern. And that is when onSave is called, if there are errors in here, it'll actually propagate them and make sure the whole page shows the errors. So the first time someone presses next, whether it's immediate or later, it won't allow this to actually go forward until all of these errors are corrected. It's nice to have this and leave in the disabled errors so you have both belt and suspenders so that someone can't press then, but if they do, it'll go ahead and show all the errors. So with both of them in place, I could press next immediately and get all the errors, or as I start typing, we can see it's going to be blank while I have errors, and as I fix them, it's going to start to fix them. But if in the middle of it, I go ahead and press next, because it might enable it temporarily, we can go ahead and include it. There are other ways of doing this, like checking to see whether a control has been touched, but those are a little bit more advanced, and I'll leave you to some of the examples that are out there to take a look at that. But vValidation is one way that I really recommend from validation, but I would look at the other validation frameworks. It might fit better into the model of the style of JavaScript that you like writing. You might want all the validation actually as code blocks inside of the views, or you might want the validation to be emitted from someplace else. So there are some other options. So next, let's implement that call to the server. Now let's send that data back over to the server. So if we go back over to checkout, we can simply call the server code here by using Axios. Just like we did a get, we can actually do a post here. And I'm going to go to API customer, and the API is called customer because a customer is always bound to the current user. And we'll see what that looks like in a little bit. And then I'm just going to say this.customer. I'm going to pass in all the data that I've been bound to, and it'll go ahead and make it into JSON, put it in the body, and do all the work for us. We should be able to then call then, and this is going to return when the post is finished. And from here, we'll have to figure out what next really means. Does it mean going to a different page? Does it mean changing pages if we get into a full spa? We'll figure out what that means in a little bit. But we'll also want to catch an error here, just in case something bad happens. And for us to show this catch, let's go ahead and add to our data element an error property, just like we did before. We'll get around to adding a busy flag later. Let's just start with the error. And remember, because we may be using the this pointer, we'll want to go ahead and bind it here. Because we're not using the this pointer yet here in the then function, I'm not going to bother binding to it. And right before the post starts, I'm just going to say this.error equals empty string, so that if we have an error, it'll disappear for us. Let's just go ahead and alert, saved the data, just so we can see it actually happen. Over in our checkout, we'll need to have a place for our magic error. And just like we did before, we'll just create a class of alert, danger, make it nice and red. We'll show the error there, and we'll do a quick VF so it doesn't take up any space if the error is there or not. Just like we've done before. Should be pretty simple. So if we come here now, let's go ahead and fill it with my magic data. We press next, we're going to get a failed to save customer. I wonder what's wrong with why it won't actually save the customer. The problem we have, we go ahead and look at the error. Let's refresh that page, put in our magic string, and let's go ahead and press next. We'll see that down here the post is returning a 400, a bad request. Let's look at editing it for a minute and see if whether we can get it to actually work. There's our request body. That all looks good. Oh, there is no address. Let's debug this for a minute and we'll see what it looks like. We come over here to the customer controller. There's a call down here that we're posting to for posting directly to the customer class. This is an API call that we're using there. And this expects a customer. If we look at the customer, we have the name, we have the phone, the company isn't required. We have a username, which certainly we're not going to supply. But then we have a collection of addresses. And we're setting address as a property. Oh, so we're supporting that the customer has more than one address, but when we actually collect this information, we're only collecting it as a single object. Now, we could change our client or server side so we can just use these classes, but more likely, what we're going to want to do is actually create a view model for the customer. So let's do that real quick. Let's create a customer model. And this is going to have the same properties that we want the user of our API to actually use. We could just create a single address called address to match what we think we want to use on the client side, but I actually want this to be an address model. The reason for that is, let me go ahead and generate a new class and a new file for that, is we may want some validation there, and we'll see that in the next video. So for our address model, we're just going to copy the main pieces here. Just the same properties that we saw, and we're not going to put country, so we'll only include the ones that we're actually going to care about for now. And because of that, over in our controller, we can change this to customer model. Let's bring in that namespace. And so if we look at this customer model and we just add it, the namespace to our property, when we get this model, it will contain the data we need in order to add it to the repository. But of course, our repository, our database, doesn't know about the shape of the customer model, so we'll actually have to create it. So we'll go ahead and say the customer is going to be a new customer. We should be able to just say name, model.name, phone equals model.phone, and addresses equals new list of address. And then we'll just actually mark and say cust.addresses.add new address. This address, we could go ahead and copy those same things as well. We're starting to go down a route, though, where we're going to get into a lot of copy and paste. We happen to only have a couple of properties here, but let's go ahead and use a mapper to make this a little easier. So let's go to our NuGet packages. We're going to want a package called Automapper. If you're already using a mapping with ASP.NET Core and you prefer it to Automapper, that's fine. I'm just using Automapper because I think it's a very useful one. It just happens to be the one that I'm most comfortable with. Accept the license. Make sure and read that license really carefully. And now that we have this, let's go ahead and set up Automapper for use. And let's do that next. So let's use mapping to allow us to change what we're sending in from the API to what we're actually saving in the database a little easier. First thing we're going to need to do is to go to Manage NuGet Packages, and we're going to want to look for Automapper. If you have Automapper, go ahead and just install it if you haven't installed it already. And then we want to set up Automapper. Automapper doesn't work with ASP.NET purely out of the box because what we're really going to need is one more dependency. You could actually just get this dependency, but it's nice to know where Automapper is. So if you put in Automapper and then dependency, that will show you the Automapper extensions Microsoft dependency injection. This is a special small library that adds extensions to allow Automapper to be injected into the dependency injection for ASP.NET Core. Once that's installed, let's go ahead and get rid of NuGet, and let's open up our startup.cs. All we're going to need to do is in configure services, is say services.add Automapper. And that'll be in the Automapper namespace, and that'll add Automapper to our system. Now, what does that really mean? That means that over here in the customer controller, we can now add as another dependency an iMapper, which is an Automapper, as a property that can be sent in, something that will do the mappings for us. But we need to configure them. And the way you do that is actually to create a new class, and I'll call it my mapping profile. Call it whatever you want, but it actually derives from a class called profile that is in Automapper. And essentially, all that the Automapper configuration inside the startup does is looks for classes that derive from profile and then uses them, executes them in order to create the mapping. So I'll create a constructor here, and I'm just going to say create map. And here I'm just going to create a map from customer to customer model. So I'm telling it to map automatically, unless I make something different, allow me to map from a customer object to a customer model object, essentially copy all the properties for me. And then I'm going to say reverse map so that I can do the reverse. I can take a model and create a customer. And the other one we'll need here is create map for address to address model. Now, this also gives you the opportunity to change the way some of the mappings happen, but we're not going to worry about that right now. Now that we have all this set up, we should be able to go over to the customer controller, and instead of doing this weird odd work, what we're actually going to do is say mapper, map, and get me a customer for the model. And it's going to assume that we want to come from the customer model because of the type here. And we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to say add to the addresses from mapper, map, address from model.address. And then we can actually add the customer here and just change this to use the customer instead. Let's debug this so we can see what this looks like. So let's just refresh our page here, fill in our data and say next. And it should get to the point where it's going to show you the store model here. There's our address, there's our name and phone, and then let's try to create the map. This new customer now has those properties that it saved, but the addresses itself is null. So we're going to want to actually change that. Let's stop this for a moment and just say cust.addresses equals new list of address. In fact, the proper fix here, go back to the customer in the entities, and let's just initialize this with a new list of address. This way, when a new instance of customer is created, not that when it's read, but when it's actually created, it'll start with this being a valid collection. So let's run it again. Put our magic in, press next. We get our customer the way we want, and then we should be able to add our address the way we want. So we now have at least one address, and then we can tell the database to save it, and we got a successful save to the database. And so we've gone round trip by using and changing some of the server to include things like mappings so that we don't have to have the same data structures on the client as we do on the server. Now, depending on your pain points, changing this code to manipulate it to create a collection of address instead of actually having just a single address could certainly do it, but it is going to make your bindings a little weird and a little odd and a little harder to work with in the JavaScript. So it matters whether you want the complexity on the server or the complexity on the client. Having those two different kinds of data means you're going to have to do it somewhere. The missing piece here is validating that same data on the server. And so let's do that next. So now let's see what we need to do the same validation we had on the client on the server. So you may have noticed that there is this call that says model state is valid. And this is a check to see whether any server-side validation fails. So even though we get the correct data here, this data may not match what the model state for that data is. Now currently this is always going to be true because our customer model doesn't have any validation in here. So one of the ideas and the questions I get a lot is, what about going to the actual entity and adding the validation here? And that is useful and can be the right thing to do if your validation matches what you want as your rules to the database. But I don't like to corrupt that data here with attributes. I really want to do it in models instead. I find it a little cleaner, a little easier to manage. Currently, there's no good way that I know of to actually take this data and push it into the Vue model validation. There may be some options there in using things like jQuery validate to do that. But for my needs, I'm usually going to add these manually. So here I'm going to say required, and that's going to bring in this component model data annotations namespace that Microsoft has been using a long time that contains some common server-side validators. You can create your own server-side validations as well, but it does mean we're going to need to want to match it on both sides of what we want. So if you remember, both the phone number and the name were required, but we were also adding a min length of 5 to the name as well. So if we go over to the address model, we can do the same thing. We can make sure to bring in the namespace, and then our address line is required, our city, our state, and our postal code are all required. And so this is going to allow us to really figure out and make sure that all this data we're being sent is correct. Now, why does this matter? I just showed you all this code in Vue to make sure that we couldn't send the API unless it was already valid. Doesn't mean that someone couldn't get into your system and send you arbitrary APIs. You still have to check on the server to make sure that all this data is actually valid, so you don't get corrupt or dummy or broken data just because someone was crufting up or manually creating calls to your API to set this. This allows you to have the validation on both sides so that you're giving the convenience to the customer on the client side for making it right before it sends it to you, but you're also protecting your databases by saying that only valid data is going to come through, because you might imagine creating this API and then having a Xamarin app or an iOS app that calls those same APIs later. You want to make sure that that data doesn't accidentally get in without those exact same data rules by calling that API. So for instance, let's go ahead and just for a moment put this required on address line 2. And let's go ahead and run this again, build it and run it. Let me get rid of a couple of these extras we have here. And in our store, remember that we have no address line here or any server-side validation. So it'll still return to us failed to save customer. And why is that? If we go back to the customer controller and let's just set a breakpoint here and let's see what's actually happening. The isValid is going to be false, and that's because the model state itself has the data in it about what is wrong. Error count equals 1. The keys of the dictionary, if I dig in a little deep, are actually going to say what validation failed. And one thing you can do that's often commonly done is instead of just saying failed to create customer back, is we can actually send the model state as the result of the bad request. And that'll include all errors we have. So let's run this one more time. And I'm going to use the debugger to see what is actually happening. So let me do networking and cross XML HTTP request, which is what Vue is using to do this. And let's go ahead and refresh this page. Let's bring in all our data. Remember, we still have that address 2 line that even though our validation here is wrong, we still want to make sure that we're not getting bad data. So let's call it, and it'll give us a 400. But what does this 400 actually look like? We look at the actual response. It's showing us that address line 2, the address line 2 field is required. So the payload of the response, we could actually use some JavaScript to look at the payload that was responded to show some of these errors that might not be shown on the server. This is up to you. Sometimes giving this information through is going to leak some of your rules to the customer, but this is only going to include the rules that were violated, so it might be okay. In our case, I'm going to leave it as returning the model state, though I'm not really showing it to the customer. I'm just showing the failed to save customer in hopes that they were the same. Of course, if we come back and fix the model by getting rid of our required address line 2, and we press next again, it'll go ahead and be successful. So we've interacted with the server by getting data, by saving data, by validating that data. Let's go ahead and wrap up this module. So what have you learned in this module? I've talked about calling APIs requires an external library, and I've shown you how that works. I introduced form binding so that you can use two-way binding in your own projects. And I've talked about how validation works and stressed the idea that it has to happen both on the client and the server.